Alright everybody, welcome back, and today we are taking out the only true Delta Wing that the US has at the moment, which is of course the F4D. So you may be wondering what exactly a true Delta Wing is, and pretty simply, it's just that it has no rear elevator, or at least a separated elevator. You know, if you look at the A4 for example, it does have a Delta Wing, but it also has a dedicated horizontal stabilizer. The F4D only has the Delta Wing and a vertical stabilizer. So the elevators are built into the wing along with the ailerons. I believe they're called elevons, if I remember correctly. I might be wrong. But in any case, until we get something like the F-106, this is going to be the only true Delta Wing that the US has, for what it's worth. Now, what does a Delta Wing do for you? So it gives you lots of AOA, and you're able to point your nose pretty much wherever you want, but in exchange, you bleed a ton of speed. And you can probably tell every time I pull my nose around, even though I do have an afterburner, I am losing a lot of speed, which is why if you can see right here, I'm being very careful. I'm only pulling a little bit at a time. I'm not doing a full turn because I know if I do that, I will bleed 3, 4, 500 kilometers an hour of speed easily. So like I said earlier, this thing is at 9.0, and compared to pretty much everything else at 9.0 or below, you're going to be faster. This thing is barely supersonic. It's like the F11, which is also at 9.0 as well. It also has the same armament with 4 Colts for the cannons, and then of course 4 AIM-9Bs as well. This is a pretty good kit for 9.0, and for me at least, 9.0 US has been a pretty good matchmaker. I've been getting a lot of down tiers to 8.3, 8.0 even, and even when I do get up tier, there's usually only an 8.7, 9.7 game, which this thing can deal with pretty easily. Now if you do get a full up tier to 10.0, this plane of course does not have flares, and so you're going to have to use those AIM-9Bs to try and flare your AIM-9Ls or the R60Ms in a head-on. But you don't usually have to deal with that, and even when you do, there can only be 4 A10s on the enemy team. So this is a perfect example of what I was talking about when it comes to the flight performance. You can see I am so slow right now because I've been in a sustained turn, but in exchange that does allow me to easily make that MiG-17 overshoot. The problem is that once he overshoots, I don't have nearly enough speed to actually, catch up to him and shoot him, which is, the goal of it. The engine does help quite a bit, especially because it has an afterburner, and you have a pretty good thrust-to-weight ratio for the BR. You're going to come out at like 0.8 or so on a typical fuel load with missiles, which is very competent, and it'll allow you to accelerate very quickly. You do got to keep in mind that as you're turning, you're going to be bleeding a lot of speed, and the plane cannot put out enough thrust to make up for it. So, at higher speeds, it does compress, which allows you to maintain that energy. You can see I'm only hitting like 8 Gs right here, and surprisingly enough, it does help you a lot of the time because it doesn't really feel mushy like, the F-16, for example. So it just really helps the energy retention. Once you fall below around like 9 to 800-ish kilometers an hour, this thing starts pulling the nose around like crazy. So you can see I've been using my AIM-9Bs liberally. These things are surprisingly effective at this BR, especially in a down tier. So for those of y'all who haven't used an AIM-9B before, the AIM-9B is basically the first missile most trees are going to get. It's the first missile they get in the US tech tree as well. So it is a 10G short range rear aspect IR missile. So it's not able to hit people that are heavily maneuvering, it's not able to hit people that are actually aware that it's there. But if someone is slow, if they're crippled, or if they're not paying attention, it's pretty effective. And you can see I just fired at 2 people that were either slow, like the G91 for example, that was 4 kilometers away, because I saw he was incredibly slow, I knew the missile would get there. Or in the case of the other plane that I fired at that, I knew that it was both slow and it was turning in the same direction. So it can do 1 turn to lead in front of somebody, has no issues with that. The problem is when somebody turns right, for example, and then cuts back across to the left. That's when the missile starts to have issues when it comes to energy. So in most cases, I'd recommend using that within like 2 kilometers or so. The only reason I fired at the G91 was because I had a very good feeling that he wasn't looking at me, that he wasn't going to turn at all, and I knew he was incredibly slow. So now, as for the guns, they did actually get the realshatter buff that pretty much everything else did, and they are pretty spicy now. You get 4 of them. They don't have much ammunition, as you can see, but you can, of course, still deal with it. So the easiest way is just going to be practicing trigger discipline. Only shoot when you know they're going to hit, because 4 of these 20s will do quite a bit of damage, but there is another option. So there is small and large caliber guns, controls, and you can buy them separately. These guns, for whatever reason, are actually coded as 2 separate calibers, and so you can see what I'm able to do is to press the small caliber to fire the inner guns and the large caliber to fire the outer guns. And so what this allows me to do is to get twice the trigger time, although I do sacrifice some of my firepower as well. So this may be something you want to consider. Personally, I only use this in one game because I'd rather have the extra firepower and know something is going to kill in a single burst rather than having to spray with two of them. But with the real shatter changes, it may be worth it. I've seen a lot of people who recommend it. Just for me, at least, I don't really see that huge of a use for it. So last thing I do want to talk about is the wings. So for those of y'all who remember when this plane first came out, many people, myself included, did not redeem it because at the time it had a horrible, horrible habit of ripping its wings, like the moment you touch them. They were the most fragile wings I have seen in a very, very long time, even more so than something like the A4, for example, which is notorious for snapping its wings. So that issue seems to have been addressed. I only ripped once or twice during the course of my games. And one of those times, actually, it was just a wingtip, and I was actually able to recover it and fly it back to the base. So take that as you will. You do still want to be careful, at least from my experience. I wouldn't recommend, doing full elevator the entire time. It's not something like the Draken, for example, where it's just not going to rip no matter how hard you're pulling. You do got to be very generous with it. At the end of the day, this is still a massive wing with a ton of lift. And so it's going to give you a lot of lift, sure, but that means it's also exerting a lot of force on the aircraft. So it does kind of make sense. It can be a little frustrating sometimes, but for the most part, you're not really going to have to worry about it now. Just be a little bit careful if you have to. Overall, though, I would actually recommend giving this thing another try if you haven't recently. I had a really good time in it, actually. I had several 6 or 7K games in it. It's been a really good experience for me, and honestly, I had a better time in it than I did in the F11 video I made recently, so take that as you will. Energy retention aside, the flight performance it has is really good at the VR that it's at. And if it tells you anything, some of these clips where you see me pulling this off, they're not even spaded yet. I've been stock running this thing, and even stock, I didn't have a terrible time in it, although, of course, it's not quite as good as it could have been. Last but not least, separate from the plane itself, as for the channel, it actually recently passed 7,500 subscribers. We're at 7,881 at the time of recording. I really do appreciate y'all. I did just want to give y'all a heads up. I am going to be trying to hit 10,000 subscribers by the end of the year if possible. So if you're not subscribed already and you like my content, I'd appreciate it if you go ahead and hit that subscribe button down below. In any case, I'll catch y'all next time. So, peace, y'all.